What if the waitress you overlooked at a luxury gala sat down at the piano, and changed everything? What if a single performance could unravel years of buried dreams, secrets, and second chances? This isn't just a story about music. It's about rediscovery, redemption, and the power of one moment to rewrite a life. Stay until the end, you won't believe how it all comes full circle. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel so we can keep bringing powerful stories like this to life. They said Florence was a city of art, of color, of poetry carved in stone, but for Lena Chen, it was a city of ghosts. The rooftop of Il Cielo Blue, perched high above the Renaissance skyline, glittered with candlelight and laughter. Waiters in sleek black uniforms floated through the sea of polished cutlery and whispered conversations. The Duomo loomed in the distance, bathed in golden twilight, its shadow stretching long and lean across the cobbled piazzas below. People called it romantic, poetic, eternal. But Lena knew better. Florence wasn't eternal, it was frozen. And so was she. In the heart of that rooftop, she glided with a silver tray balanced effortlessly in her hand, a quiet symphony of practiced grace. Each movement calculated, each smile calibrated, each interaction invisible by design. The world wasn't supposed to notice her. She'd made sure of that. But if you looked closely, if you followed the flicker in her eyes as she passed the grand piano collecting dust in the far corner of the terrace, you'd sense it. That subtle ache. The way her fingers would twitch ever so slightly when she passed too close to the keys, as if something deep beneath her skin had stirred from a long, unwilling sleep. Lena Chen was not who she pretended to be. She was not born to carry trays. She did not grow up dreaming of late-night double shifts or calculating tips to pay for her brother's physical therapy. She had once been a name whispered in conservatory halls. A child who didn't just play music, she became it. Her teachers in Vienna had said she possessed synesthesia, that she could see color when she heard sound, that melodies moved through her blood like a second language. And then, one rainy night, everything went dark. No one at Il Cielo Blue knew that story. They only knew she was reliable, quiet, efficient. That she never complained. That she always showed up, even when her shoes were falling apart, even when her joints ached from lack of rest, even when her landlord threatened to shut off the heat. Especially tonight. The restaurant buzzed with anticipation. A billionaire tech mogul from San Francisco was hosting a private dinner, and the staff had been briefed with militant precision. No mistakes, Francesca, the head server, had warned. No delays. And if Ethan Caldwell even hints at a complaint, you fix it before he finishes the sentence. Lena didn't flinch at the name, but something flickered behind her eyes. Ethan Caldwell was known for two things: building an empire on artificial intelligence, and dismantling people with a single glance. He had dined here twice already that month. The first time, he sent back 3 bottles of Chianti for being too confident. The second time, he spent 20 minutes explaining to the sommelier how wine should think like software, predictive, elegant, scalable. Tonight, Lena was assigned to his table. It was nearing 7:15 p.m. when he arrived. He wore tailored Italian wool, a timepiece that probably cost more than her yearly income, and a disarming smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He brought with him an entourage of finance executives and tech disciples. All men. All sharp-edged and silver-tongued. All speaking in language that sounded like code disguised as power. Lena approached the table with practiced calm. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice low and even. "Welcome to Il Cielo Blue. May I begin with our house wine selection?" Ethan glanced up, his gaze landing on her face like a weight. Something about the way his lips curled suggested that he enjoyed knowing she was being watched. Then his eyes slid past her, toward the piano in the corner. "That thing ever get used?" he asked lazily, interrupting the conversation at his table. "Only on weekends, sir," she replied, careful not to break rhythm. "For brunch performances." He turned his eyes back to her. You play? There it was. The question she hadn't answered in 9 years. I used to, she said. Of course you did, he replied, as if it were a script. Everyone used to do something special, right? Until life slapped the music out of them. One of the men at the table laughed. Another raised his glass. Lena said nothing. She didn't flinch. She just smiled, a smile that felt like swallowing glass, and turned away to retrieve their wine. But something had shifted. The piano was no longer just a fixture in the corner. It had become a weight in the room, magnetic and terrible, pulling her backward through time. She could almost hear it again, that first recital at the Vienna Conservatory, the air thick with expectation, the way the entire audience had held its breath as she lowered her hands to the keys. The Steinway beneath her fingers had felt like home. Like breathing. Like destiny. And then she saw her mother's face, proud and luminous in the front row. Her mother's hands, later, gripping the wheel of the car as they drove home in the rain. The headlights. The screech. The silence. Lena, a voice snapped her out of the spiral. It was Matteo, her coworker. Table 6. They want more truffle shavings. She nodded, grateful for the distraction. But even as she moved toward the kitchen, her eyes betrayed her. They drifted once more toward the piano, its glossy surface reflecting candlelight like a mirror made of secrets. Later that night, after the final course had been served and the dishes cleared, Francesca pulled her aside. Caldwell asked for you, she said, sounding somewhere between suspicious and annoyed. He wants to speak privately. Lena followed Francesca's gesture toward the small lounge at the back of the rooftop, where Ethan now sat alone with a tumbler of something amber and expensive. You've got presence, he said as she approached. Most servers shrink under pressure. You don't. You know how to move in a room like this. That's a rare thing. Lena said nothing. She didn't trust compliments from men like him. I'm hosting a private gala at my villa in Tuscany next weekend. Investors. Celebrities. High-profile crowd. I need someone who won't embarrass the evening. I'll pay triple your normal rate. Triple. The number echoed in her brain. Her brother's physical therapy bill. Her grandmother's medication. The unpaid utilities. The cracked floorboard in the kitchen. Triple could buy more than time, it could buy hope. And yet, standing there, face to face with the man who had turned her past into a parlor game, she hesitated. I'll do it, she said finally. Excellent. He stood, buttoning his jacket. And if the piano still tempts you, don't worry. There'll be one at the party. He said it with a smile. But Lena didn't miss the glint behind his eyes. He was daring her. Setting a trap wrapped in velvet. And she had just agreed to walk into it. When she returned to the kitchen, Matteo raised an eyebrow. What did he want? Nothing, she replied. But as she wiped her hands on her apron, her fingers trembled. That night, long after the restaurant had closed and the city had gone to sleep, Lena walked the long way home. She didn't take the tram. She didn't rush. She needed the cold air, the empty streets, the sound of her own footsteps echoing through the darkened alleys. She stopped by the Arno River and stared into the water, watching the reflection of the moon ripple like an unfinished symphony. Her hands still itched. They ached with memory. She flexed her fingers, slowly, as if reacquainting them with breath. She hadn't touched a piano in 9 years. But something had been awoken tonight. Something ancient and fierce and unrelenting. And though she didn't yet know how, or when, or even why, Lena Chen knew one thing. The music was coming back. And it would not ask for permission. The morning of the gala, Tuscany lay draped in mist like a veil guarding a secret. Vineyards blurred into watercolor ridges, and winding roads disappeared into fog. Lena Chen sat quietly in the back seat of the transport van, watching olive trees slip by like silent sentinels. She hadn't spoken much during the 2-hour journey from Florence, but her silence wasn't from fatigue. It was calculation. 1,000 thoughts moving in parallel. She had told herself this was just another shift. A job. Triple pay. A uniform. Nothing more. But she knew better. The moment the Caldwell villa came into view, rising from the hill like something out of a billionaire's fever dream, Lena felt the lie collapse inside her. The place was outrageous, modern glass wings spilling out from a restored 17th-century stone core, trimmed with climbing roses and security cameras. The kind of home that didn't ask for your awe, it demanded it. She stepped out onto the cobbled courtyard, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. Her black jacket hugged her frame as the wind swept through the valley, carrying with it the faint scent of cypress, lavender, and something colder. Something like inevitability. Inside, the staff was already moving like clockwork. A luxury catering company had been flown in from Milan. Barbacks were setting up curated gin bars in 3 different salons. A pair of sommelier trainees were polishing stemware so fine it caught fire in the chandelier's light. Every detail shimmered with calculated opulence. Lena didn't need to be told that the night ahead would be a performance. Francesca, the head server from Il Cielo Blu, was already there, clipboard in hand and scowl in place. She greeted Lena with a curt nod and motioned her into the main hall. Main reception. You'll be floating between the lounge and the atrium, Francesca said. Stay out of the east wing. That's private. Piano's in the atrium, and no, you're not playing it. Lena's breath hitched. So he had told them. She followed the route in silence. As she entered the main living area, her shoes clicked against white marble that shone like still water. Art adorned the walls, real art, not the prints they sold to tourists in the Florence alleys. Abstracts. Portraits. A Kandinsky original hung above a minimalist fireplace, its colors clashing brilliantly against the villa's soft cream palette. And there, in the far corner, waiting beneath a skylight, was the piano. It was not just any piano. It was a Steinway Model D, concert grand, ebony gloss, lid raised like a black-winged bird mid-flight. Even from across the room, Lena could tell it was immaculate. Perfectly maintained. Perfectly tuned. It had presence. It had weight. And it saw her. She didn't move toward it. She didn't look too long. But her body knew. Her heartbeat stuttered, the way it used to backstage before recitals. Her spine straightened without thinking. Her fingers, even hidden inside black silk gloves, curled with memory. Don't even think about touching it. The voice was unmistakable. Smooth. Sardonic. Ethan Caldwell stood near the bar, already dressed in an elegant black tuxedo that looked as if it had been molded to his frame. A crystal glass of scotch was balanced in his hand like a prop in a theater play. He walked toward her, stopping just shy of where her personal space would have begun. That's a €500,000 instrument, he said, almost casually. We have a professional coming later. Juilliard trained. Your services are, elsewhere. Lena offered him no expression. No acknowledgement beyond the minimum required. But something flickered behind her eyes, a fire not yet ready to burn, but warming. I understand, sir, she said softly, then walked away before he could say more. As night fell, the villa filled with Florence's elite. Tech giants from Milan, actors from Rome, oil heirs from Geneva. The kind of people who laughed in 3 languages and collected watches that required safes. The air buzzed with the low hum of curated playlists and expensive perfume. Designer gowns swirled past Lena as she offered champagne with one hand and silence with the other. She heard snippets of conversation as she passed, discussions about acquisitions, rising crypto portfolios, private islands, opera tickets, and second homes in Bali. It was a world of luxury so saturated it no longer sparkled. It glowed. Yet, underneath it all, Lena moved with a stillness that belonged to another frequency. She observed everything, the flick of a jealous glance, the stumble of a lie, the brittle laughter of women who were used to being watched but not seen. Everything was going smoothly until just past 9 o'clock. Ethan's phone rang. He stepped away from the conversation he was having, answered with a quick talk, and listened for maybe 10 seconds. Then his face changed. The crowd didn't notice. But Lena did. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened. "What do you mean you're not coming?" he hissed into the phone, his voice low but poisonous. "You were paid. You signed a contract. You." A pause. Then, a sharp breath through the nose. "Fine. Go to hell." He hung up and turned, catching Francesca in his sights. "The pianist just cancelled," he said. "Find a solution." Lena froze. The playlist faded out. The planned live music was supposed to begin in minutes. It was part of the evening's mood board: elegance, intimacy, live classical textures to create ambience. Now it was gone. The buzz in the crowd began to shift. Subtle at first. Guests glanced toward the atrium. The absence of live music was like a draft in the room, a vacuum pulling at the edges of the party. Ethan's eyes swept the hall. Then they landed on Lena. He straightened. "You," he said, loudly enough for nearby guests to turn. "You said you used to play." Lena went completely still. "I think," he continued, his voice lifting as he walked toward her, "that our guests would love a little spontaneous talent. Don't you?" A few people chuckled awkwardly. Others turned to see what he meant. The spotlight began to swing toward her, invisible but blinding all the same. She began, but Ethan raised a hand. "Come now," he said. "Surely you're not afraid. You did say you played once. Or were you exaggerating?" The words weren't just a challenge, they were a trap. Carefully baited. Perfectly timed. She could refuse. Walk out. And he'd win. But something in the way he stood there, expecting her to shrink, to flinch, to fold, sparked a rage she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't loud. It didn't roar. It burned like a slow, steady flame beneath the ice. She handed her tray to another server. "I'll need a moment," she said simply. The room began to quiet. Guests whispered. Ethan smiled, not kindly, but with amusement, the kind that came from watching someone walk toward humiliation. Lena walked toward the piano. Her heels tapped against the marble like a metronome marking time. The atrium opened around her. A dome of glass framed the moon above. The Steinway waited. And the past rose to meet her. As she approached, her hands began to sweat. Her mind raced. What would she even play? Could she play? Had she truly forgotten the way? No. It was still there. The pain. The beauty. The loss. Everything. She sat down. Adjusted the bench. The familiar posture wrapped itself around her like an old coat. Her fingers hovered. And in the stillness of that marble hall, as the city of Florence slept beyond the hills, Lena Chen placed her hands on the keys. She did not ask permission. She began to play. Lena's fingers hovered over the keys like they were afraid of rejection. For a long, pulsing second, she didn't move. The party around her, a swirl of wealth, crystal flutes, and curated charm, blurred into stillness. It wasn't silence, not exactly. There were murmurs, a few half-laughs, glasses clinking faintly from somewhere in the back. But inside the atrium, where the Steinway stood beneath the glass dome like an altar, time had pressed pause. She could feel them watching, Ethan Caldwell's smug expectation of spectacle, the guests' awkward curiosity, the quiet skepticism hovering in the air like dust in sunlight. She didn't blame them. What else could they expect from a waitress being goaded into a performance by a billionaire host? To them, this was either entertainment or embarrassment. Nothing in between. But they didn't know what she knew. That music, real music, never left you. It simply went quiet, waiting for your return. Her fingers trembled as they lowered to the ivory keys. She didn't choose something safe. Not something light. Not background music. She chose Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. A bold, aching, thundering piece, one that didn't ask for attention but seized it. The first chord hit the air like a verdict. The walls of the villa reverberated with the sheer weight of sound. Guests near the atrium stopped mid-conversation. Heads turned. Brows lifted. Lena barely noticed. Because the moment she began to play, she ceased to be a server in a black uniform. She became the girl who had once played on Vienna's great stages, whose teachers spoke of her as a prodigy, who could hear entire symphonies after hearing only a single phrase. Her body remembered even when her mind doubted. Muscle memory surged to the surface. Her spine curved into the shape it once knew so intimately. Her wrists loosened, hands flying across octaves like birds released from captivity. The music was defiant. It was sorrow and strength and grief and joy knotted together in crashing arpeggios and longing middle notes. And as the notes poured out of her, so did something else, something old and raw and buried. Grief. It was never far from the surface, but here, in this moment, it rushed through her like wind through broken windows. She remembered her father waiting in the hallway after every lesson, coffee in one hand, praise in the other. Her mother's soft voice humming lullabies while Lena practiced scales. The smell of their tiny kitchen. The heat from their old radiator that barely worked. The silence after the accident. How long had it been since she let herself feel it all? She played harder, pushing through the memories. Every crescendo was a scream held back for years. Every diminuendo, a breath caught in her throat. The room around her had gone completely still. No more murmurs. No more glasses clinking. Just breathless silence and sound. Somewhere near the front, a woman lowered her champagne flute slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief. Further back, a man leaned forward with his brow furrowed, eyes locked on Lena's hands. Ethan Caldwell was no longer smiling. He stood rooted in place, the mocking edge of his mouth replaced by something that looked a lot like awe. The music built toward its climax, Lena's hands moving with a speed that seemed inhuman. But it wasn't speed, it was purpose. Every note was deliberate. Every phrase a story. And in that space, she wasn't asking the audience to understand her. She was telling them. You don't know me. You don't know what I've lost. But you will hear it. By the time she reached the final passage, her arms were shaking, her breath ragged. The piece didn't end softly. It ended like an exorcism, a final declaration of something long denied. When the last chord echoed into stillness, Lena remained seated, her fingers suspended over the keys. No one moved. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. Sacred. As if everyone was afraid that clapping might break whatever spell had fallen over the room. Then, slowly, it began. Applause, soft at first, then building. Like people waking from a dream. Some were already on their feet. Others clapped with trembling hands. A woman in a green silk dress wiped tears from her cheeks, nodding as if something inside her had just been seen. Lena stood, her legs slightly unsteady. She bowed her head briefly, then turned away from the instrument. As she did, she caught Ethan watching her. Not with smugness. With something that might have been remorse. She didn't linger to dissect it. Instead, she walked quietly past the crowd, past the champagne towers and murmuring voices, through the velvet-draped hallways and out onto a small stone terrace at the side of the villa. The night air hit her like water. Cool, sharp, necessary. She leaned against the railing and exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. The vineyard stretched out below, ghostly in the moonlight. Somewhere in the hills, a bird called. Her hands were still trembling, but not from fear. From release. She had done it. Not for him. Not for them. For herself. She closed her eyes. The music still echoed through her bones. And underneath it, something new stirred, an idea. A question. Could she find her way back? Back to the part of herself that hadn't died with her parents, that hadn't been buried under bills and shifts and caretaking. The part that still wanted to create. To teach. To share. She didn't know the answer yet. But she wasn't afraid to ask. A sound behind her. She turned. It was the older man from the audience, the one who had leaned forward with such intensity. He was tall, elegant, dressed in a charcoal suit that whispered wealth and discretion. That was no amateur's performance, he said, his accent marked but soft. German, perhaps. Where did you study? Lena hesitated. Vienna. Anne. Juilliard, for a time. He nodded as if he had expected it. I'm the director of a symphony program in Florence, he said. We work with schools. Community groups. Young musicians. Your talent shouldn't be hidden behind a tray of champagne flutes. She looked at him, unsure of what to say. You don't need to answer now, he added, handing her a card. But think about this. Music doesn't forget us. It waits. Sometimes, it waits a long time. But it never stops calling. He left her alone on the terrace, the card cool in her hand, the words ringing in her ears. She looked down at the name. Maestro Dietrich Schumann. She didn't know it then, but that single conversation would lead her toward the next movement in her life. One not marked by applause, but by purpose. Not stages, but classrooms. Not performance, but legacy. But for now, she simply stood there, the weight of everything she had just let go settling into her bones. The ache in her fingers had changed. It was no longer longing. It was promise. Florence in winter had a different rhythm. Gone were the swarms of tourists and glossy storefronts screaming for attention. The city exhaled, its stone streets quieter, its churches more hollow in their echo. The cold was sharp but honest, and to Lena Chen, it felt cleansing. She had left the Caldwell villa weeks ago, but the sound of the Steinway still lived inside her. Not just the music she had played, but the silence that followed it, the way it had wrapped itself around the room like velvet. For the first time in nearly a decade, she had let herself be seen not as a worker, not as a burden-bearer, but as a musician. And something had shifted. Still, returning to music wasn't a march. It was a return, careful, unsteady, deliberate. It began in the unlikeliest of places, a crumbling building on the outskirts of Florence, whose front steps were chipped and whose windows looked like they hadn't been washed in years. The sign out front read Centro Culturale Musicale di Firenze, a community arts center that had seen better decades. Inside, the lights flickered, the walls were painted a dull beige, and the piano in the front room looked like it had weathered a war. And yet, Lena stepped inside like it was a sanctuary. The center had recently partnered with Maestro Dietrich Schumann, the German symphony director who had approached her after the Caldwell Gala. His vision was simple, almost foolishly so: give the gift of music to children who would otherwise never hold a violin, touch a piano, or know what it meant to feel the world through sound. It wasn't about breeding virtuosos, it was about planting something alive inside people who had been told their lives were too small for beauty. Lena had hesitated at first. Not because she didn't believe in it, but because she didn't believe in herself. Who was she to teach? Her fingers still shook some mornings. Her muscle memory was returning slowly, yes, but doubt came faster than scales. Still, she showed up. Her first class was a chaos of movement and noise. 10 children, all under 12, squirmed on mismatched rugs, tapping on anything they could find, plastic chairs, their own knees, the radiator pipes. Some of them didn't speak Italian fluently, let alone English. One little boy stared at her with such raw distrust, she wondered if he'd ever smiled. Lena stood in front of them, took a breath, and began with a question. "Do you know what music is?" The room stilled. "Sort of. It's sound," one girl said. "Like, when you sing." "It's fun," another whispered. "It's noise," said a third, clearly unimpressed. Lena smiled gently. "Music is all of that. But it's also a way to tell a story without words. It's a way to say what you feel when you can't say it out loud." She walked to the old upright piano and placed her fingers on the yellowed keys. They stuck slightly from disuse, but she coaxed a melody from them, a simple, delicate progression. Nothing fancy. Just a waltz-like rhythm that fluttered like breath. "This," she said, "is what it sounds like when someone misses home." The room went quiet. That day, something opened. The weeks that followed were messy and beautiful. The children weren't prodigies. Most had never taken lessons. They banged on instruments with more enthusiasm than precision. But they listened. They learned. Lena taught them clapping rhythms, then simple scales. She had them make up stories and turn them into melodies. They played what sadness might sound like, what joy felt like in sound waves. They learned about composers, yes, but more importantly, they learned how to listen. To themselves. To each other. The little boy who had once stared at her like she was made of smoke now stayed after class to ask questions. The girl who barely spoke found her voice through a wooden flute. A shy brother and sister duo wrote their first song together, just a few lines and notes, but Lena nearly cried when they performed it, trembling and proud. Outside of class, Lena practiced. The maestro had arranged for her to have limited access to a small soundproof room with a baby grand piano. It wasn't a Steinway, but it didn't have to be. What mattered was that she played. Every day. Sometimes for minutes. Sometimes for hours. Sometimes with fire. Sometimes through tears. She found herself composing again. Not with the clarity of the past, but with a new depth. Her melodies weren't clean. They meandered. They stumbled. They returned to themes, circled back to unresolved chords. And yet, they lived. One late afternoon, as she worked on a piece she'd titled Una Vita Seconda, A Second Life, a knock came at the practice room door. It was her younger brother. Marco had finished a therapy session nearby and surprised her. He stood there with his backpack slung low and that particular brand of awkward pride that teenage boys carry like armor. "Grandma said you're famous now," he said, grinning. "I'm not," Lena laughed. "I just played at a party." "You made a tech billionaire look like an idiot. That's kind of famous." She rolled her eyes, but her heart softened. She motioned for him to come in. "Want to learn something?" she asked. He hesitated. "You know I'm not like you. I don't have the music thing." "You don't need to be like me," she said. "Music's not about perfection. It's about expression." She placed a drum pad in front of him, gave him a set of sticks, and tapped out a rhythm. To her surprise, he followed. Not perfectly, but with heart. And that was enough. Soon, Marco started coming by more often. He helped clean up after classes. He tried the keyboards. He learned how to tune a guitar. He talked with the kids, showed them videos, made them laugh. Lena watched him bloom in the same space where she herself was being reborn. In the months that followed, word about the program began to spread. Maestro Schumann started arranging community performances, low-stakes, high-impact events in piazzas and parks. Lena organized Piano in the Piazza, a rotating outdoor concert where her students performed for passers-by. One day, a tourist recorded a performance and uploaded it to social media. The video went viral. Comments poured in. Who is she? What's her story? How can I help? It wasn't just the performance that moved people, it was the context. A former prodigy, once silenced by tragedy, teaching children to reclaim the music within themselves. It struck a chord, literally and metaphorically. Even Ethan Caldwell reached out. Through a carefully worded email, he offered to formally fund the expansion of the program. He didn't mention the gala. He didn't apologize again. But Lena didn't need him to. She could feel in the tone of his message that something had changed in him too. He had been a mirror that night, ugly and sharp, but he had forced her to face herself. She accepted the support, but not the spotlight. This wasn't about her ego. It was about access. About giving kids what she once had and then lost. One evening, as she was locking up the center, Maestro Schumann stopped her in the hallway. "You've done more in 3 months than most teachers do in 3 years, he said. "Have you thought about making this permanent?" "I've thought about it," she said. "Every day." He nodded, then handed her a folder. Inside were plans to expand the program to other districts in the city. They wanted her help shaping the curriculum. Training the next wave of instructors. Creating a model that could be replicated in other cities. Lena didn't answer right away. Not because she doubted it. But because she wanted to say yes with her whole heart. That night, she stood again by the Arno River. The same river she had stood beside the night after the gala. But this time, she wasn't lost. The water moved with certainty. And so did she. She pulled out her notebook and jotted down the melody that had been dancing in her mind all day. It had no name yet. But it was full of warmth, full of breath. The heart remembers pain, yes, but it also remembers how to sing. And Lena Chen was finally ready to teach it how. The auditorium lights dimmed just as Lena Chen stepped behind the heavy red curtain of the Teatro Verdi, and her breath caught in her throat. The hum of anticipation from the audience, the quiet shifting of programs in eager hands, the small squeak of chairs, all of it struck her with a strange, beautiful weight. It wasn't the fear of performance that made her chest tighten. Not anymore. It was reverence. A sacred awareness that tonight was more than a showcase. It was a moment. A declaration. A reclamation of something that had once been buried so deeply, she thought it might never surface again. 1 year ago, she had been a server at a rooftop restaurant, forgotten in the blur of clinking glasses and luxury requests. Now she stood backstage at one of Florence's most historic concert halls, guiding a group of children, her students, her dreamers, into the spotlight. They huddled beside her, cheeks flushed, small hands clutching sheet music and trembling fingers tightening bows on violin strings. Their nervous energy vibrated in the air, alive and electric. Lena knelt beside them and smiled. "Remember, it's not about being perfect," she whispered. "It's about telling your story. Let them feel it." A small boy named Luca looked at her with wide eyes. "What if I mess up?" She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Then you keep playing. Because your music matters, even if one note is wrong." He nodded, and she saw something in his face that reminded her of herself, of that little girl on the Vienna stage, long before the night that changed everything. As the curtain slowly rose, a soft gasp rippled through the audience. Parents leaned forward, cameras in hand. Some had never been in a theater this grand before. Others had crossed cities to be here. Lena's students filed out onto the stage in neat rows, like a constellation forming in front of her. She watched from the wings as the first performance began, a duet between 2 students who had met in her beginner rhythm class and bonded over shared shyness. Their hands trembled, but their notes were true. The audience clapped with the kind of tenderness reserved for something fragile and courageous. Next came a group performance, a medley of melodies composed by the children themselves, stitched together into something wholly unique. Each phrase bore the fingerprint of a different student. A boy who had spent his early years in a refugee camp. A girl whose mother worked 3 jobs to pay for bus fare. A pair of siblings who had once cried at the thought of speaking aloud, now playing in perfect harmony. Lena felt her heart swell with each note. She had taught them how to listen, yes. But they had taught her something deeper, how to begin again with broken pieces, how to make something beautiful from what remains. In the audience sat her grandmother, wrapped in a shawl she had crocheted during Lena's long practice nights. Next to her, Marco leaned forward, chin on his hand, his eyes shining. He had started playing percussion in the youth ensemble and now spoke of one day becoming a music therapist. Lena wasn't sure where he'd end up, but she knew one thing, the music had reached him too. And just a few rows away, Ethan Caldwell sat, quiet and attentive, a subtle figure among the crowd. Since the gala, he had remained involved from the periphery. He had funded new instruments, expanded outreach programs, and, perhaps most surprisingly, attended every major student performance. He never asked to speak. Never took credit. But Lena saw the change in him, the softening at the edges, the curiosity where once there had been only control. At intermission, Maestro Schumann approached her backstage. His warm hands clutched a folder filled with new expansion proposals, but for the moment, he set it aside. "You've built something extraordinary," he said. "This program, it has a soul. It's yours." Lena looked out at her students and then back at him. "No. It's theirs. I just gave them a room and a reason." He smiled. "And now, they're giving it to others. That's how legacy begins." The second half of the concert was Lena's personal contribution. She had spent months composing a piece for this moment, an orchestral arrangement called "The Road Found Again," a title borrowed from something her grandmother had once said in passing, not realizing the poetry of it. The composition wove together classical structures with the raw, intuitive phrasing of her students' original melodies. The children would perform it with her, each one bringing their own part to the tapestry. Violins, flutes, hand drums, piano, voice. As she stepped out onto the stage and sat at the newly donated grand piano, courtesy of an anonymous benefactor, though Lena had her suspicions, the room hushed to breathlessness. Her fingers touched the keys. The first notes were soft, tentative, like footsteps on an unfamiliar road. Then came the rising harmonies, carried by the students, building into something bold, layered, and luminous. It was not a performance polished to perfection. It was real, messy in the most human of ways. A chorus of hearts learning to trust their own rhythms. By the final chord, tears were streaming down more than a few cheeks in the audience. The applause was thunderous. Lena stood and bowed with her students. But she knew, this night was not an ending. It was an overture. A beginning of something vast and unseen. During the reception afterward, as guests sipped cider and children giggled with post-performance giddiness, Lena's grandmother approached her with something wrapped in a handkerchief. "It's time," she said, pressing the bundle into Lena's hands. Inside was a worn envelope. Faded from time, yellowed at the corners. On the back was a name written in elegant cursive, her mother's. Lena felt her breath catch as she carefully unfolded it. The letter was brief. "My sweet Lena. If you are reading this, then you have found your way back to the music I always knew would live inside you. You may not follow the path we imagined. But whatever road you choose, if it sings with your soul, follow it. Music will always lead you home." Tears blurred the ink as Lena clutched the paper to her chest. In that moment, surrounded by students and strangers and the echoes of melodies still hanging in the air, she felt her mother's presence more vividly than she had in years. Later that evening, as the lights dimmed and the theater emptied, Lena remained at the piano. The room was quiet now, the applause a fading memory. She ran her fingers softly over the keys, not to play, but to feel. So much of her life had once felt like a detour. A forced pause in a symphony she thought would never resume. But now, she understood. Some of the most beautiful music is not written in straight lines. It is shaped in crescendos of grief, rests of silence, motifs of resilience. And when it returns, if it returns, it carries more than notes. It carries meaning. She closed her eyes and let the silence speak. This, too, was part of the song. Lena Chen's story is not one of instant stardom or overnight transformation. It is a story of stillness. Of waiting. Of grace under pressure, of strength built not in the spotlight, but in the shadows. It is a story for anyone who has ever put their dreams on hold, not out of weakness, but out of necessity. For anyone who has walked away from what they loved most, not because they stopped loving it, but because life demanded more of them than they ever expected to give. We first met Lena beneath the golden skies of Florence, where she moved like a ghost through a luxury rooftop restaurant called Il Cielo Blu. At first glance, she was a quiet, elegant server. Efficient. Invisible. One of many who made the machine of hospitality move smoothly in the background of a world designed for the rich. But from the very first moment she passed the unused grand piano in the corner of the terrace, we understood, there was something more. A story beneath her silence. A memory beneath her motion. Years ago, Lena was a prodigy. A musical mind born for greatness. She trained in Vienna, performed at Juilliard, and lived with a fire in her fingers. But tragedy has a way of folding lives into unexpected shapes. A rainy night, a car crash, and the sudden weight of becoming a caretaker to her brother and grandmother forced her to abandon the concert halls and trade them for restaurant kitchens. The piano fell silent. Not forgotten, just shelved, gently, painfully, like a love letter never sent. When tech mogul Ethan Caldwell appeared at Il Cielo Blu, bringing with him the arrogance of the privileged and the cold charisma of power, Lena found herself thrust into a situation she hadn't asked for. A dinner. A job offer. A gala at a villa in Tuscany. And eventually, a cruel challenge, perform at his party after the professional pianist cancelled, not out of admiration, but as a way to humiliate her, to prove, perhaps, that servers don't belong at Steinway's. But Lena stepped up. And when her fingers touched those keys, after 9 years of silence, the music didn't just return. It roared. It sang. It remembered. That night changed everything. Not just for Lena, but for everyone who witnessed it. Because in her playing, they saw something that can't be bought or built or branded. They saw authenticity. They saw someone who didn't need to prove her worth to anyone, because her worth was inherent in every note she poured into the room. What followed was not a leap back into fame or fortune. Lena didn't chase the stage again. She chose something more enduring. She chose to teach. She walked into a broken-down community center and began again, this time not as a performer, but as a guide. She sat on cold floors with children who didn't yet know how to dream. She taught them to listen, to feel, to create. Her classroom was not just a space for music, it became a sanctuary. For kids. For their families. For herself. She watched a refugee boy write his first melody. A shy girl find her voice in flute solos. Her own brother, once shy and silent, began to play percussion. Bit by bit, music returned to their lives, not just as a performance, but as a language of healing. Her work grew. From one class to many. From one neighborhood to several. She built a program that gave others what she had lost, and finally found again. A path to expression. A way to reclaim their voices. And it culminated in a concert at Florence's historic Teatro Verdi. Her students, dressed in their best, stood under bright lights and played for a sold-out hall of family, strangers, and once distant supporters. Among them sat Lena's grandmother. Her brother. Ethan Caldwell. And in Lena's hands was a new composition, The Road Found Again, an orchestral tribute to the beauty of detours and the power of return. As the last notes faded, the room erupted in a standing ovation. And for Lena, it was not the sound of success. It was the sound of restoration. A circle completed. That night, her grandmother handed her a letter from her mother, a message meant for her first big concert, one she never got to play as a child. Music will always lead you home. And it did. Not to a stage. But to a purpose. To a life of meaning. To a legacy. The lesson, what Lena Chen's story teaches us. Lena's story isn't about music. It's about the quiet heroism of people who keep going, even when no one is watching. It's about those who carry the weight of others, who give up their own dreams to protect someone else's reality. And most of all, it's about the truth that what is buried is not lost. What is silent is not broken. What is forgotten is not gone forever. It teaches us that our gifts are not disposable. It teaches us that pain, when honored and transformed, becomes power. It teaches us that even in a world obsessed with speed and status, there is room for stories that unfold slowly, like a melody building toward a hidden crescendo. In Lena's choice to teach rather than perform, to serve rather than shine, to restore rather than revenge, we find the kind of courage that speaks directly to the soul. How to apply this story to our lives? So what do we do with this? First, we look inward. What part of you have you silenced? What piano is gathering dust in the corner of your heart? Maybe it's not music. Maybe it's painting. Writing. Dance. Or simply a way of living you once imagined but set aside because life got complicated. Because people needed you. Because money ran short. Because grief came knocking. But Lena's story reminds us, those parts of ourselves are still there. They're waiting. Waiting for you to remember them. To try. To stumble. To dare. Second, we look outward. How can we be like Lena, not just in reclaiming our dreams, but in creating space for others to do the same? Can you mentor someone? Can you create something that helps people see their own potential? Can you pass on your knowledge, your love, your story, not for applause, but for connection? The world doesn't need more influencers. It needs more inspirers. People who do the quiet work. People who remind others what's possible. Lastly, remember that every setback is a comma, not a period. You're not done. Not even close. If you're reading this, if you're breathing, your story is still unfolding. And the music in you, the talent, the passion, the voice, it can come back. Maybe not the same way. Maybe in a classroom instead of a concert hall. Maybe in a community center instead of a stadium. Maybe in a child's laughter instead of a trophy. But it will matter. Because authenticity always does. A final note and an invitation. If Lena's journey moved you, if it made you feel something stir inside, if it reminded you of something you once loved, or someone you used to be, or someone you want to become, then don't keep that to yourself. Take a step. Play a note. Write a line. Start again. And if this story inspired you, we invite you to join us in celebrating more stories like Lena's, stories of heart, of second chances, of unexpected transformations that start in the quietest corners. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling meaningful stories, the kind that don't just entertain, but uplift, awaken, and connect. Because somewhere out there, there's another Lena waiting for a sign that it's not too late. Let's make sure she hears it. Together.